Bandwidth for the Hauger History Podcast graciously donated by Podbean.com. Podbean, find a favorite podcast today or start your own at Podbean.com. Welcome into another edition of the Hauger History Podcast. Take your seats. It's time for class to begin. Hope you're enjoying your September of 2016 or whatever time that you may be listening to this evergreen podcast. Evergreen meaning things can last for a long time. They don't need to be taken down after a certain amount of time. Content doesn't get old, just like history doesn't get old. Isn't true. History gets older each and every day. Today we're talking about an 8th grade subject, getting our 8th graders ready for their advanced study of the colonies, which a lot of them will remember back in California to their 5th grade year, where they read a lot about the colonial empires of England, France, and Spain and their origins in the United States of America before they were called such. And today's 8th grade episode follows a series of conversations and lectures and readings and activities about New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies and their initial differences, and how regionally these three groups of what would soon be states grew to be very different and unique. Hello again. Hello everybody again. I'm Mr. Hauger, putting my words together here in an early 7 a.m. session and taking some regional comparisons of the colonies. Thanks for joining us. You can follow us on Twitter at HaugerHistoryPod and email HaugerHistoryPod@gmail.com with your questions about social studies. Let's talk first about what colonies that we're talking about, trying to come up with a mnemonic device if you are someone who likes to do that, or other ways to just remember southern, middle, New England colonies. The southern colonies: Virginia, Maryland, South and North Carolina, and Georgia. The middle colonies: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. New England colonies: Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. There's many different ways that we could attack the differences of how these colonies were established and what made them unique. Let's start somewhere near the beginning, where in the southern colonies, the colonists initially settled in Virginia under a royal charter. Remember, a charter was permission from the government to go and seek a colony and to go and establish a settlement. Royal charter was given to the Virginia Company. Stockholders and settlers expected profits from gold and crops. In our 8th grade class, we talked about the specific term joint stock companies, or if you were someone who was willing to go out on an adventure and maybe someone who was seeking a fortune or profit, you could gather together a large group of people to diversify your investors, where your money is going from, those sources, those deep pockets, and that you could give a percentage of your earnings. If you've ever seen the TV show Shark Tank, that's often deals that are made are, I want this much money for this much control of your company. Very similar back in colonial days. I will give you this much money and I expect this percentage of returns or this amount of gold or crops or land. That's how the southern colonies were established, beginning in Virginia. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, initially settled the region known as New Amsterdam. They were followed by the Swedes, and finally the English came in. And for one of the first early intercolonial conflicts, England actually took by force New Amsterdam, renamed it New York, as in York, England, if you didn't already aware of that fun fact. New England colonies. They had strict rules for adhering to a godly community. This was a Puritan settlement. And dissenters often had to leave and establish other colonies in the same region because at first the Puritans were very specific about how they wanted things done. And among all the three regions, while each had their spots with religious freedom, the middle colonies were known for religious freedom, like in Pennsylvania, where William Penn allowed his Quakers and his neighbors to live peacefully, even with the Native Americans, which was special in that area. New England was heavily Puritan, and many people went there for religious reasons, fleeing England, but sometimes found that even dissenters in the New England communities had to live somewhere else if they weren't adhering to the strict standards of religious compliance. Southern colonies, let's talk about the economies. Let's talk about business, dollar bills to you all. I think that was the slang, right? Plantation economy in the South, based on single crops and high volume, big amounts, mainly tobacco and rice. Virginia and the southern colonies of the Carolinas, these areas produced enough tobacco for the majority of the world at the time and had that special humid environment, that longer growing season that wasn't present in the middle and New England. So large amounts of crops, plantation economy. Going to need lots of labor there. We're going to talk about that later. Middle colonies. This was a moderate. Think of the middle as being in between two people in an argument. You've got a little bit of everything. There's a commercial economy. There's city life, depending on small farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. But they did have a little bit of everything, a little bit of shipping, a little bit of ocean access, a little farming, subsistence. Sometimes they were so good at growing wheat that they could export to the north and south. And they had merchants, people that could specialize. So you would have hubs of towns where you'd have specialists in many different fields making their crafts. And in New England, subsistence, family-operated farms. Subsistence meaning I just grow what my family needs. And maybe I'll grow enough for my neighbor. So I'll provide all the corn for the party. You bring the carrots, you bring the potatoes. Everyone's bringing their part, either for their own family or their own very small community. And there was also a business community where small merchants could set up town, and you would have very small towns. Middle colonies had big cities. Southern colonies had large plantations moving across from the north to the south. Let's start back in the south again. Slaves and African American population provided most of the labor for those large plantations, and predominantly most of the labor that they would supply would be hard labor in the fields. It took a lot of people to harvest that cotton, to harvest that tobacco, and all of those cash crops. In the middle colonies, you mainly had families and indentured servants providing most labor, but you would have slaves as well for farms that were large enough to require that labor. And also you would have slaves that would go out and do the small business labor, being assistants, going out and being fishermen, and doing a variety of different jobs. And in New England, mostly families, cottage industries provided the labor for their farms and their businesses, but there were slaves in that area as well. In the middle colonies, going back for a second, it was about 7% of the population in the 1750s. All right, if we're talking about social status, the South was very socially stratified. What does that mean? I know, Mr. Hauger. That means that there was a big difference between the white people who were free and owned plantations and the African and enslaved people who had to do all the hard work and had very little. That's correct. Yeah, there's a big difference there between those two class systems, and it permeates for many years and causes some political turmoil later, as we will get into further units of your 8th grade year. In the middle colonies, it was much more heterogeneous, meaning mixed. That's probably a scientific term that you've come across by this point of the year. The society was based upon diverse cultures, languages, and religions. And in New England, it was mixed as well. It was mainly white ownership of property and people who were wealthy, so there was definitely a class system, but it was still more mixed than the South. In the South, those wealthy elite plantation owners provided colonial governments, had all the power and influence. In the middle, it was small land and business owners that often provided that governments and often had influence through their colonial legislatures. And in the North, heavily relied on church members and landowners. And they often had quiet town meetings, not quiet, but quaint, more visions of town meetings, town rule, and small business operations. In the South, they're living in widely dispersed settlements on large and small plantations. In the middle colonies, people were living in small dispersed settlements. And often in New York and Philadelphia, we forget to mention that those became major cities. And some people historians that traveled through compared them to London and Paris and the cities of Europe. And in the New England region, people lived in close-knit, clustered villages and lots of small towns. Small town New England. So I hope that gets you into the foundations of differences between the economic, social, political, and religious, differences between the New England, middle, and southern colonies. And of course, that gets updated and changed as we evolve further past the 1750s and get more towards the founding of the United States as we know them today. But in 10 minutes, that should get you pretty close to an understanding of the differences between the three. Remember, you can find us on Twitter at Hauger History or email us at haugerhistorypod@gmail.com with your questions or your requests for subjects to be recorded. I've been getting a few of them now coming in from across the country, which is very, very cool. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for free on iTunes, and have a great week and enjoy your studies of social studies and the rest of the world in all of your subjects. This is Mr. Hauger saying I'll see you next time, and class is dismissed. Make sure you push your chairs in.